My mother's name was Dora.
Oh, really? What kind of lady are you?
She's mine.
The Wild West Saloon, a place of myth and legend, where gunslingers and outlaws rubbed shoulders with lawmen and locals. Though these are depicted in Hollywood movies, it is not exactly in the way they were. But what really went on behind those swinging doors? And were the doors of saloons actually always swinging? Join us as we separate fact from fiction and explore the truth about Wild West saloons, revealing what Wild West saloons were actually like. Earliest saloons. We really can't talk about the Old West without talking about dozens, maybe hundreds or thousands of saloons of the American West. Sounds like the most important part of the Old West? Yeah, and we sure do have a picture of saloons within our minds whenever the term comes up, and it goes like a wooden false front, a wide boardwalk flanking the dusty street, a couple of hitching posts, and the always present swinging doors brushing against the cowboy as he made his way to the long, polished bar to get a whiskey to wet his dry throat. However, that's not basically all that there is about the saloons, but we'll get back to that shortly. You see, when America began its movement into the vast West, the saloon was right behind, or more likely, ever present. Though places like Taos and Santa Fe, New Mexico, already held a few Mexican cantinas, they were far, few, and somewhat inaccessible until the many saloons of the West began to sprout up everywhere a settlement was established. While saloons are the known names of these establishments, they are not only called saloons, but names like watering holes, shebangs, cantinas, grog shops, gin mills, fandangos, and many more interesting terms. Some owners spent so much money to make sure that they appeared as opulent as possible, while some just didn't care about the appearance, presenting their saloons like crooked casinos, brothels, opium dens, and places that would have been better torn down. Many did attract outlaws, shady gamblers, con artists, and men on the run, while some preyed on the innocence of the naive ones in some cases. As you've seen in movies, some travelers actually just enter the saloon and we're never seen outside again. You already know what that is about. After the disappearance, all that came out decades later were bones, or absolutely nothing at all. There's a case like that back in the 1920s in Calaveras County, California, when a rancher digging post holes stumbled on several skulls. At first, nobody knew whose bones they were, but after investigations, they were identified as murder victims, and the saddest part was these bones belonged to very young men. These were men who just vanished after going into a particular saloon that was never identified, and of course, the same thing happened in many places in the West. As you must have expected, there were those rough-and-tumble saloons where patrons may have had to fight their way to the door to get out without being cleaned out or killed. And while brawls were common and gunplay in saloons was actually fairly rare, some were rolled in an alley for everything they had. While movies may have made you believe that saloons are all the same, they were actually different and had different vices. Some were very violent, while others took every precaution to ensure that they were not. There were notorious saloons where a bartender may slip someone a Mickey Finn to knock them out and rob them, or Shanghaiing them by selling them to a waiting ship, as was popular on the Barbary Coast of San Francisco. There are also the women, the gamblers, the cheats, the outlaws, the con artists, the wannabe tough guys who were like Doc Holliday, who spun tales of how tough he was by boasting about the number of men he had killed. However, on the other side, there are not always those who drank into a stupor, gambled their wages away, cheated someone, shanghaied a traveler, or lost their claims or ranches on a hand of poker. While we can't have a real number of those that were actually like that, many saloons were just social centers where people hung out and socialized. As common as saloons were, did you even know that the first place that was actually called a saloon was at Brown's Hole near the Wyoming-Colorado-Utah border? It was established in 1822 and catered to the many trappers during the heavy fur trading days. And in the earliest days, the most common saloons were located in a place filled with soldiers, which included one of the West's first saloons at Bent's Fort, Colorado in the late 1820s. They are also common in places with cowboys such as Dodge City, Kansas, and places where miners scrambled along rocks or canyons in search of their fortunes. Now, before we go into what the Old West saloons actually looked like, take time to erase the pictures of ideas that you have in mind as you're about to see the saloons for what they actually were. Let's start with the drinks. No matter the type of definition you try to give to a saloon, you can't just take drinks away from it. They're totally inseparable. And if you think anyone you know right now is drinking something really hard, wait till you hear about the drinks served in these saloons. In those hard-scrabble days, the whiskey served in many saloons was some pretty wicked stuff made with raw alcohol, burnt sugar, and a little chewing tobacco. Ah, now it all makes sense. Little wonder it took on weird names such as Tanglefoot, 40 Rod, Tarantula Juice, Taos Lightning, Red Eye, and Coffin Varnish. Other popular wonders were Cactus Wine, made from a mix of tequila and peyote tea, and Mule Skinner, made with whiskey and blackberry liquor. The house rotgut whiskey was often 100 proof, though it was sometimes cut by the barkeep with turpentine, ammonia, gunpowder, or cayenne. Back in the day, the most popular term for the libations served in saloons was firewater, which sounds weird because water and fire don't ever mix. But there's a story to it. The name originated when early traders were selling whiskey to the Indians, and to convince them of the high alcohol content, the peddlers would pour some of the liquor on the fire as the Indians watched the fire begin to blaze. But most Western saloon regulars drink straight liquor, and they don't even try to order a fancy cocktail or sip at their drinks. That's because they get ridiculed unless the person was an already known tough guy or he had a proven reputation as one. Foreigners who don't know all about this often become victims of drink at gunpoint. Wait for the explanation. If you visit a saloon as a visitor and you try to nurse your drink, you would be forced to swallow a fifth of 100 proof at gunpoint, and that is usually done for the foreigner's good, end quote. Saloons also served up volumes of beer. But in those days, the beer was never ice cold, usually served at 55 to 65 degrees. Though the beer had a head, it wasn't as sudsy as it is today, and patrons had to knock back the beer in a hurry before it got too warm or flat. Artificial refrigeration and pasteurization were not introduced until the 1880s, when Adolphus Busch brought it to the U.S. brewing process, launching Budweiser as a national brand. Before then, folks in the Old West didn't expect their beer to be cold, accustomed to the European tradition of beer served at room temperature. The games. No matter how much you walked around the cities taking notes of saloons, you'd definitely find a poker table in almost every saloon surrounded by prospectors, lawmen, cowboys, railroad workers, soldiers, and outlaws for a chance to tempt fortune and fate. There were many games, but the most played and the most popular was Pharaoh. While you may have never seen Pharaoh, it is a game of cards played when the banker shows every player the cards on the table. Then the players go ahead to bet on which card would be the winning card. Other popular games were Brag, Three-Card Monte, and dice games, such as High-Low, Chuck-a-Luck, and Grand Hazard. That was how it all started. Peaceful and fair, or maybe not always fair, until there came gunfights and bloodshed. It all began with many of the Old West mining camps, such as Deadwood, Leadville, and Tombstone, who all became known for gunfights over card games, as they did for their wealth of gold and silver ore. Professional gamblers like Doc Holliday and Wild Bill Hickok learned early to hone their six-shooter skills at the same pace as their gambling abilities. Taking swift action became part of the gambler's code. Shoot first and ask questions later. As time went by, other games were included as saloons continued to prosper, inviting more competition. These additional games included billiards, darts, and bowling. In some saloons, they even included piano players, can-can girls, and theatrical skits. Soon, there were different types of saloons that you could imagine. For example, gambling saloons, restaurant saloons, billiard saloons, dance hall saloons, bowling saloons, and of course, the ever-present, plain old-fashioned, just drinking saloons. These saloons took on different names that were not similar or related to one another, such as the First Chance Saloon in Miles City, Montana, the Bull's Head in Abilene, Kansas, and the Holy Moses in Creede, Colorado. In many of the more populated settlements, these saloons never closed, catering to their ever-present patrons 24 hours a day. 7 days a week. Yeah, what you typically call open 24/7. Some didn't even bother to have a front door that would close, making us wonder why every saloon in Hollywood movies has this door. Talking about doors, why not let's talk about the doors? One of the very important questions about the saloons is whether they all actually have these swinging-style doors. You know, there's hardly a Hollywood movie about the Old West that hasn't shown us these doors. These types of doors, called cafe doors, and sometimes referred to as batwing doors, were found in many saloons, but not nearly as often as they are depicted in popular movies. However, you can't blame the movie crew. What better door is there for the movie hero to burst into and also to toss the bad guys through? Now you see, you must agree it looks really easy too, and it's true that they are designed to allow easy passage between two rooms, or from the outside to the inside, by using bidirectional hinges. Shorter than full height, they are situated in the middle of the frame. They were practical because they provided easy access, cut down the dust from the outside, allowed people to see who was coming in, and provided some ventilation. Most importantly, it shielded the goings-on in the saloon from the uninterested ones who might be passing by. Most saloons, however, had actual doors. Even those with swinging doors often had another set on the outside, so the business could be locked up when closed and to shield the interior from bad weather. As mentioned earlier, on the other hand, some crude saloons didn't have doors, as they were open 24 hours a day. Inside the saloon, the seating setting was never what you see in bars, or like you must have imagined. The seats were centered around the tables where men talked and gambled. There were no bar stools, so men just drank while standing, placing one foot on a rail along the bottom for a relaxing lean. When you enter a typical saloon, be rest assured you can depend on seeing the long paneled bar, usually made of oak or mahogany and polished to a splendid shine. Encircling the base of the bar would be a gleaming brass footrail with a row of spittoons spaced along the floor next to the bar. The only thing is that these men didn't use the spittoons. No matter how many spittoons there are, they still spat around on the floors, and you'll soon know why. While we can describe the saloons like this, their decorations varied from place to place, but most often reflected the customer's ideals. In the cow towns of the prairies, one might see steer horns, spurs, and saddles adorning the walls, while in the mountains, a customer would be met by the glazing eyes of taxidermied deer or elk. Often, there was the infamous nude painting of a woman hanging behind the bar. What you will find in excess are towels found everywhere on hooks, made sufficient for wiping beer foam from mustaches or upper lips. It may just disgust you to know that those towels were rarely cleaned, serving as homes for germs and disease. One other sufficient material was spittoons. It was very common for men to smoke and chew tobacco at saloons, and when they did, they spit all over the place. In order to prevent floors from being covered in spit and the like, proprietors placed spittoons at various locations. However, these same saloons encouraged these men not to use them. They displayed signs that read, "If you spit on the floor at home, spit on the floor here. We want you to feel at home." And yes, the men felt at home all the time. The good side is dust helped to soak up spilled beer, spat out tobacco, and any other fluids that made their way onto the floor of a saloon. If a saloon had a wooden floor, sawdust could also be used to swallow up the unwanted stuff. Customs of the saloons. While saloons seem like a place for shootouts and gunfights, they were purposely made for men to socialize with one another. And one of the ways to know the regulars at saloons is when you see men who have acquired calluses on their elbows. This is a result of prolonged and heavy leaning on the bar. Truth is, you really see men of the West without that emblem. They usually didn't drink alone, nor did they drink at home, so they came out to the saloon needing each other's company. The patrons were a varied lot, from minors to outlaws to gamblers and honest workmen. What they were not were minorities. Though it brought people together generally, not everyone was welcomed. Saloons of the West did not welcome other races. Indians were excluded by law, but an occasional black man might begrudgingly be accepted, or at least ignored if he happened to be a noted gambler or outlaw. But if a Chinese man entered a saloon, he risked his life. However, There was one type of white man that was also generally not welcome. That was the soldier. There were several reasons for this. Given the makeup of the many men of the West, adventurers, people who didn't fit in the East, outlaws and Civil War deserters, they had no respect for the men who policed the West. Nor could these independent-minded men respect anyone who was made to stand at attention and obey all orders. Finally, for some unknown reason, they blamed the soldier for infecting the parlor house girls with diseases. Due to the culture at the time, respectable women were also excluded. Unless they were a saloon girl or a shady lady, women did not enter saloons. This tradition lasted until World War I. In retaliation, the ladies were primarily behind the Prohibition movement. Men of the West were used to asking other men about their first names only. The belief was that if you become too curious, it is impolite, as most of them had shady backgrounds. Therefore, both men's and women's pasts were respected and were not inquired about. If and when it was, it could be very unhealthy for the inquirer, who might end up dead in the street in front of the saloon. For instance, one would never ask a rancher the size of his herd, which would be just the same as asking a man to see their income tax return today. Another custom was the expected offer to treat the man standing next to you to a drink. If a stranger arrived and didn't make the offer, he would often be asked why he hadn't done so. Even worse was refusing a drink, which was considered a terrible insult, regardless of the vile liquor that might be served. On one such occasion at a Tucson, Arizona saloon, a man who refused the offer was taken from bar to bar at gunpoint just to teach him some manners. However, if a man walked in broke and needed a drink, few men would refuse him. On the other hand, if he ordered a drink, knowing he couldn't pay for it, he might find himself beaten up or worse. The holy services. From the way the saloons have been described, wouldn't you be shocked to know that even church services were held there? This is because the saloon was usually one of the first and biggest buildings within many new settlements. So for the space, it was used as a public meeting place, including church services. Judge Roy Bean and his combination saloon and courtroom were a prime example of this practice. Another saloon in Downeyville, California, was not only the most popular in town, but also the office of the local justice of the peace. Also, the first church service in Hays City, Kansas, was held in Tommy Drum's saloon. However, not all services went smoothly. In August 1884, a group of cowboys reportedly shouted and fired shots during a Presbyterian service in a saloon in Brighton, Colorado, which led the saloon keeper to quit the business shortly thereafter. But even after that quit, it didn't stop a lot of people from opening the saloon business, as it was what was used to boom cities at the time, just as entertainment was used to publicize and enhance anything today. Talking about entertainment, let's not forget the dance hall girls. These girls have just one job: to brighten the evenings of lonely men starved for female companionship. Not what you're thinking right now. The saloon girl was not a prostitute, except for rare occurrences in the shabbiest of saloons. Though the respectable ladies considered the saloon girls unworthy and without virtue, most of the girls wouldn't be caught dead associating with an actual prostitute. Their job was to entertain the guests, sing for them, dance with them, talk to them, and perhaps flirt with them a bit, inducing them to others in the bar, buying drinks, and patronizing the games. Even though these girls helped the business grow, not all saloons employed saloon girls, such as in Dodge City's north side of Front Street, which was the respectable side, where guns, saloon girls, and gambling were barred. Instead, music and billiards were featured as the chief amusements to accompany drinking. And in the girls' defense, most of them didn't know what they were getting into before they did. They were mostly refugees from farms or mills, lured by posters and handbills advertising high wages, easy work, and fine clothing. Many were widows or needy women of good morals, forced to earn a living in an era that offered few means for women to do so. They earned as much as $10 per week, making a commission from the drinks they sold. Common drinks bought for the girls would only be cold tea or colored sugar water served in a shot glass. However, the customer was charged the full price of whiskey, which could range from 10 to 75 cents a shot. In most places, the proprieties of treating the saloon girls as ladies were strictly observed, as much because Western men tended to revere all women and because the women or the saloon keeper demanded it. Any man who mistreated these women would quickly become a social outcast, and if he insulted one, he would very likely be killed. At least these ladies got respected by the men, even if the respectable ladies scorned them. And of course, as for the respectable women, the saloon girls were rarely interested in the opinions of the drab, hard-working women who set themselves up to judge them. In fact, they were hard-pressed to understand why those women didn't have enough sense to avoid working themselves to death by having babies, tending animals, and helping their husbands try to bring in a crop or tend the cattle. In the early California gold rush of 1849, dance halls began to appear and spread throughout the boom towns. While these saloons usually offered games of chance, their chief attraction was dancing. The customer generally paid 75 cents to $1 for a ticket to dance, with the proceeds being split between the dance hall girl and the saloon owner. After the dance, the girl would steer the gentleman to the bar, where she would make an additional commission from selling a drink. Saloon owners. If you were to guess the people who ran the saloons, what would have been your answer? Of course, those who were regulars at the place. Several noted gunmen of the West owned saloons, tended bars, or dealt cards at one time or another. These included such notable characters as Wild Bill Hickok, Bill Tillman, Ben Daniels, Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, Ben Thompson, Doc Holliday, and many others. Maybe this would explain why there was the ever-present violence in the establishment at the time. In 1876, Bob Younger said, "We are rough men and used to rough ways." Coupled with the public access, the flow of potent whiskey, and the general lawlessness of the times, the saloon was an inevitable violent home. Numerous killings were reported inside these Old West saloons, and they include Wild Bill Hickok, who was killed by Jack McCall while playing poker in the No. 10 Saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota. Also, Bob Ford, who killed Jesse James, was shot down in his own tent saloon in Creede, Colorado, and John Wesley Hardin was shot and killed from behind on August 19, 1895, in an El Paso, Texas saloon. Many other acts of violence were instigated in saloons, which wound up with shootouts in the street or public hangings after groups that ensured order had been formed. However, as the cities developed, the saloons reduced until they were no more, bringing an end to the era of Wild West saloons. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.